For veteran Thomas Grayson, silence was supposed to be salvation. But in the misty fields of West Virginia, his German shepherd shadow refused to stop digging. Day after day, pawing at the same patch of earth until blood stained his pads. When Thomas finally joined him, what they uncovered was no relic of rust, but a buried school bus packed with soil and silence. Inside lay a child's backpack, papers from the 1990s, and a recorder that still whispered the voice of a terrified girl. This was not an accident. It was a secret that powerful men had spent decades burying. Please support us by subscribing to the channel to follow this emotional journey. The first frost of October settled like glass across the ridges of West Virginia, turning the rolling hills into a landscape of brittle silver. The sky stretched a hard and endless gray, thick clouds pressing low against the shoulders of the mountains. Wind scraped through the leafless oaks, and the pine stands like the whistle of some long-forgotten train, carrying with it the scent of iron-rich soil and smoke from distant chimneys. It was not a welcoming place. It was austere, the kind of land that tested a man's resolve before it ever offered comfort. For Thomas Grayson, that was exactly what he sought. He did not want warmth or welcome. He wanted silence. At 55 years old, Thomas bore the years unevenly. His frame was tall and wiry, shaped by a lifetime of carrying burdens heavier than his own body. His shoulders were corded with muscle that came not from gym routines, but from field labor and years of marching beneath an unforgiving sun. His face was rugged, carved by exposure and sorrow, the kind of countenance that looked like it had been etched into stone by time itself. Deep creases ran from the corners of his hazel-green eyes down toward his jawline, and a pair of faint scars stretched diagonally across his right cheek, pale reminders of shrapnel that had kissed him decades earlier in a desert war zone. His hair, once a solid dark brown, had faded into iron gray, trimmed short in the old military style as though he could never quite abandon the discipline of the uniform. His beard was trimmed but coarse, peppered with silver, and his eyes, though steady, carried a distant weariness, the kind of gaze of a man who had seen too much, who long ago stopped expecting gentleness from the world. Thomas had once lived in Charleston, in the heart of the state, where traffic never slept, and sirens fractured the night. But the city had become unbearable to him. Every car horn was an echo of alarms from combat, every crowded street a reminder of the chaos he could never control. The noise clawed at him, and the memories followed. Men shouting in foreign tongues, the smell of cordite, the sound of earth tearing apart under mortar fire. In the end, he sold what little he owned and left the city behind. What he craved was distance. Miles of uninhabited land where no one would ask him to retell stories he wanted to forget. The cabin he had purchased was barely standing, a slouching relic at the edge of a long-forgotten trail. Its wood was bleached gray by decades of wind and rain. The front porch sagged in the middle like a tired back, and its stone chimney leaned slightly to one side. Around it stretched 30 acres of scrubland and forest, the kind of place where neighbors were more myth than presence. To Thomas, it was perfect. A place where silence pressed in like a physical thing, wrapping him in its heavy embrace. The days were predictable. He rose with the pale dawn, brewed bitter black coffee in a dented tin pot, and set himself to work, repairing shingles, mending fence posts, splitting logs with a practiced mechanical rhythm. His hands bore calluses thick enough to resist splinters, his back bent and straightened in the slow cadence of labor. At night he sat on the porch, his flannel shirt smelling of sweat and pine resin, nursing another cup of coffee because whiskey only deepened the shadows inside him. He told himself the silence was working, that it dulled the edges of his memory, that the nightmares would tire of clawing their way into his skull. But then came the dog. It appeared first on a windless evening when the last light of day smeared the sky with shades of copper and bruised purple. Thomas was sitting on the porch, boots stretched out on the step, watching mist curl across the field. A flicker of motion caught his eye, a figure at the tree line. He stilled, instincts sharpening as they always did when he sensed he was not alone. It was a dog. Even at that distance, Thomas recognized the proud, angular build of a German shepherd. Its coat was mottled black and gray, thick but matted in places, giving it the look of a soldier whose uniform had been worn too long. The animal was lean to the point of gauntness, ribs faintly outlined beneath its fur, yet it stood upright, ears pricked, posture alert. Its face was long and noble, eyes amber-brown that glowed faintly in the dying light. But there was something haunted there, something that spoke of hunger and vigilance. The shepherd didn't bark, didn't growl. It only stood watching, as still as the trees that framed it. For a long moment man and animal held one another's gaze, a silent test of will across the fading field. Thomas's hand twitched toward the old rifle leaning against the porch post, not in threat, but in the reflex of a man who had spent too long mistrusting shadows. But the dog made no move. It was as though it were waiting, measuring him. When the darkness thickened, the shepherd slipped back into the woods. Thomas thought it would be the end of it. A stray, curious perhaps, soon to vanish into the endless hills. But the next night, the animal returned, standing at the same spot, at the same hour, motionless. And the night after that. On the fourth evening, Thomas found himself leaning forward on his porch seat, searching the tree line before the sun had even set. And there it was, unwavering as a sentinel. The old instincts stirred in him, the recognition of watchfulness, of discipline. He had worked with dogs before, canines that sniffed explosives, silent partners who saved more men than any medal ever could. He knew the stance of an animal trained to observe, to endure. But this shepherd bore no collar, no tag, no sign of belonging to anyone. It was a ghost of discipline past, stranded in wilderness. On the fifth night, Thomas rose from his porch and walked inside. He returned with a battered tin bowl. Inside he placed a mix of canned beans and jerky torn into strips. He carried it down, the steps, boots crunching against gravel, and set it at the edge of the yard. He did not call. He did not whistle. He simply placed it there and returned to his chair, the silence between them unbroken. By morning, the bowl was licked clean. The shepherd was back that evening, in the same place, the same posture. And Thomas felt something shift inside him, something he had long fought to bury. A thread, fragile but undeniable, stretched between them. It was not companionship. Not yet. But it was recognition, one survivor acknowledging another. The silence Thomas had sought was changing. And he knew, somehow, that his exile was no longer his alone. The nights grew colder as October deepened, and the frost clung longer to the fields each morning. Thomas Grayson had begun to notice a rhythm in the way the land breathed. The whisper of wind through the trees at dawn, the creak of his porch with each step, the far-off caw of crows circling above the valley. But alongside that rhythm came another, an intrusion into the silence he had once guarded like a fortress. It was the sound of claws tearing at earth. The German shepherd, the stray that had taken to haunting his property, had returned each night since Thomas had first left food out. The man no longer thought of it as a stranger. He had given it a name, a word that felt as inevitable as breathing. Shadow. There was something fitting in it, the way the animal moved like a shifting silhouette, always half in light, half in dark, and yet never fully gone. Shadow was no puppy. By Thomas's eye, the dog was in its prime, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, strong but weathered by hunger and solitude. Its coat was mottled gray and black, thick along the neck like a soldier's padded collar, but dull in patches where neglect had taken its toll. Its frame was lean to the point of sharpness, muscles coiled beneath the skin with a restless energy, as though every nerve inside it was tuned toward vigilance. The eyes, amber-brown and deep, never wandered aimlessly. They tracked, studied, calculated. Thomas recognized those eyes. He had seen them in the faces of men on night watch, men who had learned that attention could be the difference between surviving till dawn or never waking again. Each evening, Thomas would set a bowl at the bottom of his porch steps. Shadow would wait, silent and statuesque, until the man retreated into the safety of his cabin. Then the dog would eat, not with the frenzy of an animal desperate for survival, but with a controlled, deliberate pace, as though aware it was being observed. Sometimes Shadow lingered afterward, lying in the tall grass with his head raised, amber eyes fixed on the house. At first Thomas had found the stare unsettling. Now he found himself oddly comforted by it. But then came the digging. It began one morning just after sunrise. Thomas had risen early, as was his habit, to split wood behind the cabin. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, and in the distance he heard it, a steady scrape, scrape, scrape. He followed the sound across the field and saw Shadow pause deep in the soil at the same patch of earth by the fence line, where it had always stood sentinel. Dirt flew in rhythmic bursts behind the shepherd, the muscles along its shoulders taut, the fur at its back streaked with mud. "Damn fool dog," Thomas muttered, leaning on his axe handle. Yet there was something about the intensity of the action that caught his attention. This was no idle scratching, no search for rabbits or burrowed gophers. This was focused, relentless labor. By midday, the dog's paws were raw, dark streaks of blood, smearing across the churned soil. But it did not stop. Not once. That evening, when Thomas brought food and water, Shadow ignored it. The shepherd trotted briefly to the bowl, lapped greedily at the water, then returned immediately to its work, as though the act of digging was more essential than food itself. The pit was growing wider, deeper, until Thomas imagined it could swallow the dog whole. Days passed. Each morning, Thomas would glance from his porch and see the figure already at work, shoulders hunching and lowering with the rhythm of shoveling paws. By night, even when darkness smothered the field, the sound carried faintly to the cabin. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Thomas found it impossible to ignore. He would sit at his table, his hands clenched around a tin mug of coffee, listening to the steady persistence of an animal possessed by purpose. He thought of other dogs he had known. In Afghanistan, there had been Rex, a shepherd trained to detect explosives. Rex had once refused to move from a dusty patch of road, whining low in his throat until the squad halted. When the engineers arrived, they found an IED buried 6 inches beneath the sand. Rex had saved 6 lives that morning, including Thomas's. And yet, 6 months later, Rex had been killed when another blast shattered the convoy. The memory had stayed with Thomas like shrapnel in the soul. And now, here was another shepherd, nameless to the world but branded with a mission in its bones. Shadow's obsession gnawed at him. He found himself walking out to the field, standing a cautious 30 feet away, watching as the dog tore at the earth with ragged determination. "Enough," he tried once, his voice carrying across the distance. Shadow froze, head lifting, muzzle caked in mud, chest heaving. The amber eyes met his, pleading not for food or affection, but for recognition. Then, without hesitation, the dog bent its head and resumed. Thomas's jaw tightened. He was no fool. He had seen too much to mistake instinct for madness. Something lay beneath that soil, something that drove this animal to wound itself in pursuit of reaching it. On the 7th day, the weather turned. Rain swept across the valley in sheets, beating against the cabin roof, pooling in the ruts of the old dirt road. Thomas watched from the porch as Shadow worked through the downpour, water soaking its fur until it clung to the lean frame, droplets streaming from its snout. Mud sucked at its legs, yet it clawed deeper, as though the storm were nothing but a nuisance compared to the urgency in its chest. When night came and the rain eased, Thomas stepped into the field. He stood at the edge of the pit, the ground soft beneath his boots. The hole yawned before him, nearly 4 feet deep, its sides slick with clay. Shadow stood within it, sides heaving, chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The dog trembled with exhaustion but did not stop. With every scrape of its paw, small rivulets of blood mixed with the mud. Thomas crouched slowly, bringing himself closer to the shepherd's level. The animal paused, ears twitching, eyes flicking toward him. For a moment, the silence between them was so complete that Thomas could hear only the hiss of cooling earth and his own heartbeat. "You're not chasing ghosts," he whispered, though the words surprised him as they left his mouth. "You've found something." Shadow whined softly, a low, mournful sound, then pressed one paw into the soil again, pushing it aside to reveal a darker patch of earth below. Thomas's breath caught. He could no longer dismiss this as madness or instinct. The dog was not only digging, it was pointing, guiding, demanding that he pay attention. And in that moment, standing beneath the hard silver light of a waxing moon, Thomas knew that the silence he had sought so desperately was about to be broken. Whatever lay beneath that field, Shadow was determined to uncover it. The storm had broken during the night, leaving the valley wrapped in a thick, sullen mist that clung low across the field. Thomas Grayson stood at the edge of the pit where Shadow had worked for days, the damp soil sucking at his boots. His breath drifted in the cold morning air like smoke from a fading fire. The dog was already there, paws and muzzle streaked with mud, panting heavily yet unwilling to stop. Its amber eyes burned with purpose, and for the first time in years Thomas felt the pull of a mission. He could no longer stand by and watch the shepherd bleed itself dry. Whatever drove the animal, he would answer it. He went to his barn, an old red structure warped with age, and pulled out a relic of his former life, a heavy-duty military-grade shovel, its blade still scarred from desert campaigns. He gripped the worn wooden shaft, feeling the familiar weight settle into his hands, and returned to the hole. Shadow paused briefly, tail low, ears forward, watching as Thomas set the blade into the soil. "All right, partner," he muttered. "Let's do this together." The digging was grueling. Clay clung to the shovel, roots resisted every thrust, and rocks scraped against the metal. But Thomas worked with the steady, efficient rhythm of a soldier long trained to preserve energy. Shadow mirrored him, clawing tirelessly beside the man. Hours passed. The pit deepened, wide enough for a man to stand chest high within. Sweat mixed with grime on Thomas's brow. His shoulders screamed with old pain. Yet he pressed on, driven not by curiosity alone, but by an instinct sharpened in war. Trust the dog. By late afternoon, his shovel struck something different. A sharp metallic clang echoed beneath the earth, reverberating through his arms. He froze, the sound lingering in the silence like a gunshot. He dropped to his knees and brushed away dirt with his hands, the soil cold and damp against his fingers. Slowly, a curved surface emerged, white paint long since dulled and blistered with rust. He wiped it clean, and faded black letters revealed themselves in block script. District 47 School Bus. Thomas sat back, stunned. A bus, buried 6 feet under an abandoned field. He glanced at Shadow, who stood at the edge of the pit, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the exposed steel as though demanding acknowledgement. This is it. Unease pressed against his ribs. Memories surfaced. Convoys struck in hostile deserts. Civilian vehicles hiding horrors. The knowledge that not every discovery under the earth brought safety. He climbed from the pit and fetched his old entrenching tool, a compact folding spade he had carried overseas. With Shadow watching, he widened the hole until the bus roof stretched before him, like the exposed bones of some steel beast. Night fell, but Thomas could not stop. Lantern light flickered across the mud, casting shadows that danced along the sagging frame of the vehicle. He found the rear door, wedged tight under layers of compacted soil. With a crowbar retrieved from the barn, he pried and hammered, muscles straining as metal groaned in protest. At last, the latch gave way with a scream that echoed across the valley. The door inched open. A stale breath of earth and rot wafted out. Thomas raised the lantern and looked inside. There was no aisle, no seats, no open space. The entire interior was filled to the ceiling with tightly packed soil, as though the bus itself had been deliberately entombed. A cold weight settled in his gut. This was no accident. Someone had buried the bus intentionally, sealing whatever truth it carried within a coffin of dirt and steel. Carefully, he climbed inside, his boots sinking into the loose soil near the opening. With his entrenching tool, he began to scrape away at the packed earth. Minutes stretched into hours. His hands ached, his nails split, his lungs filled with dust. Still he dug, methodical, cautious, like an archaeologist unearthing bones. Then his spade struck something soft. He froze. Setting the lantern closer, he brushed with his fingers, the soil crumbling away beneath his touch. What emerged was a backpack, small, canvas, the kind carried by schoolchildren decades earlier. The fabric was rotted and stained, the zipper rusted, but the outline remained. Thomas lifted it gently, heart thudding. Inside were fragments, a waterlogged notebook, pages smeared with ink, a cracked plastic lunchbox decorated with the faded cartoon face of a 1990s character, and tucked deep within, a laminated hall pass card stamped with the year 1991. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. He set the pack aside and dug further. Soon his hand closed on a bundle of papers sealed in a plastic sleeve. He pulled it free, wiping away the grime. Inside were school permission slips, field trip forms, each dated from the early 1990s. The names of children scrawled in pencil filled the sheets, ghosts now whispering across the years. But it was the final discovery that stilled his breath. Near the base of the soil, his spade struck a hard rectangular shape. He dug carefully, his fingers brushing against smooth plastic. He drew it out. A micro-cassette recorder, its casing smeared with dirt but intact. The tape window revealed spools still wound tight. He held it in his hands, the relic humming with a weight heavier than its ounces. Thomas sat back in the hollowed bus. Shadow crouched in the doorway above, eyes watching with quiet intensity. The veteran turned the recorder over, imagining the voice it might contain, frozen in magnetic memory for 30 years. A child's voice, perhaps. A final message from the dark. his chest constricted with a pressure he hadn't felt since the battlefield. The terrible knowing that he stood at the threshold of a story, written in fear and sealed in silence. The lantern guttered, shadows creeping along the steel walls. Thomas tightened his grip on the recorder. Whatever secrets had been entombed here, he was now their keeper, and he knew this was only the beginning. The night was colder than Thomas Grayson had expected, the mist curling thick around the field until the world seemed reduced to a circle of lantern light and the gaping wound of earth where the bus had been unearthed. He carried the objects into his cabin: the battered school backpack, the damp papers, and the most fragile of all, the micro-cassette recorder. Shadow padded after him, its paws leaving muddy prints across the warped porch boards, tail low but steady. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and damp wool. Thomas set the lantern on the table, the flame throwing hard shadows against the log walls. He examined the recorder under the flicker of light. The plastic was scratched, the once white casing now yellowed with age, but when he shook it gently, he felt the slight rattle of tape spools within. A tiny red sticker had been pressed to its side, the ink nearly gone, but enough letters remained to form the word: camp. He fished out a set of old batteries from a drawer, remnants of supplies he kept for emergencies. With hands calloused and steady, he snapped them into place. For a moment, the recorder was silent, and Thomas braced himself for disappointment. But then, with a faint click, the machine hummed to life. He pressed play. Static filled the room, crackling like fire. Then a voice broke through, the voice of a young girl. It was high but trembling, words rushing as though time itself were an enemy. "My name is Emily Saunders," she stammered, the sound of her breath fast, ragged. "We were supposed to go to camp today. We left from the school on the bus, all of us, but they stopped us. They weren't police, they weren't teachers. They said they were with the community health program." Thomas's stomach knotted. He remembered community vans during his youth, white vehicles with painted logos, volunteers in bright vests handing out flyers. Yet the fear in Emily's voice carved away any illusion of innocence. "They had papers. They said our parents signed them. But we didn't. We didn't know. They told Mr. Parson to drive off the road. He looked scared, but he listened. We ended up in the field, and then... Her voice broke into a sob, the sound sharp enough to make Thomas's throat tighten. "They told us we had to be quiet, that it was for health research. They wore white coats. They carried boxes." Static swallowed her words for a moment, then returned, harsher now. "One of them said the Burnham Foundation would pay for everything, that it would change medicine forever. I don't know what that means. I don't want to be here. Please, if anyone hears this..." The recording cut off, replaced by a long, shrill hiss. Thomas sat frozen, the machine still spinning, though no voice came forth. Across the table, Shadow gave a low, throaty whine, ears flat, as though it too understood the weight of the sound. Thomas pressed rewind with a thumb that trembled despite years of training, listened again, forcing himself to catch each word, each tremor in Emily's voice. The name burned brightest in his mind. Burnham Foundation. He knew the name. Everyone in West Virginia did. The Burnhams were wealth and influence woven into the fabric of the state. The family owned half the clinics in the county, funded political campaigns, and held seats on health advisory boards that reached all the way to Washington. Old Henry Burnham, the patriarch, had died a decade earlier, but his children and grandchildren carried on the empire of medicine and politics. They were untouchable. Thomas leaned back, the wooden chair creaking beneath his weight. He rubbed a hand across his scarred jaw, staring at the recorder as though it might answer the flood of questions in his head. If this tape was real, If Emily Saunders and her classmates had been taken, why had no one spoken of it? 35 years had passed. Had families not searched? Had police not investigated? Or had every answer been buried as deliberately as that school bus? He rose and crossed to the wood stove, feeding it another log. Flames leapt, chasing the chill back from the walls. His reflection stared back at him from the dark cabin window. Hard features lit by firelight, eyes shadowed with something he hadn't felt in years, a rising sense of duty. He had come here to escape missions, to run from responsibility. Yet the shepherd at his feet and the voice on that tape whispered otherwise. Shadow shifted closer, laying its head across his boot, a warm weight that anchored him. Thomas reached down and brushed his fingers across the dog's fur. "You knew," he murmured. "You dragged me to it because you already knew." The shepherd's amber eyes lifted, calm and steady, as if confirming his words. Thomas knew what this meant. Someone had buried the truth, smothered it beneath 6 feet of dirt, and walked away certain that time would finish the job. But Shadow had unearthed it, and now Thomas held the key to a story that would shatter the silence of an entire town. The Burnham Foundation. The name beat in his skull like a war drum. He remembered hearing of their charitable drives, glossy pamphlets that painted them as saviors of rural health. Yet his instincts told him what soldiers always knew: appearances lied. Emily Saunders's voice had cut through that facade, and it would not leave him. The lantern flickered, and Thomas shut off the recorder. He tucked it into the backpack alongside the damp papers, wrapping them in a dry cloth. His movements were deliberate, ritualistic, because he understood. This was evidence, this was testimony, and men who buried buses would not hesitate to bury the truth again. He extinguished the lantern, leaving only the fire's glow. Shadow shifted beside him, already half asleep but alert enough that one ear remained cocked toward the door. Thomas sat in silence, listening to the hiss of burning logs, his thoughts heavy with the voice of a girl long gone. It had been 35 years, but her plea still echoed. "Please, if anyone hears this—" Thomas clenched his fists. He had heard, and that meant he could no longer turn away. The morning broke thin and gray, a weak light filtering through the mist, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise over the valley. Thomas Grayson stood on his porch with the micro-cassette recorder heavy in his coat pocket, the weight of the voice within pressing against him like an obligation he could not cast aside. Shadow lay at his feet, head lifted, ears pricked toward the dirt road that wound down into town. The silence that once comforted Thomas now gnawed at him, filled with questions too dangerous to carry alone. He knew what he had to do. By midday, Thomas had driven his battered Ford pickup into the county seat of Fairhaven, a town of faded brick storefronts and a courthouse square where the flag hung limp in the still air. The sheriff's office occupied an old stone building at the corner, its steps worn smooth by decades of boots. Thomas parked across the street and sat for a long moment with the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the glass doors. He had left the service to escape the chain of command, to bury the weight of missions and reports. But here he was, about to file one more. Inside, the office smelled of old coffee and disinfectant. A deputy at the front desk, a young man with a buzz cut and a too bright smile, glanced up. "Can I help you, sir?" "I need to speak to Sheriff Whitlock," Thomas said, his voice gravel low, carrying the tone of someone used to giving orders, not requests. The deputy hesitated, then nodded. "She's in her office." Sheriff Ada Whitlock was not the kind of woman easily overlooked. In her late 50s, She carried herself with the lean strength of someone who had fought too hard for too long to waste energy on pretenses. Her frame was tall and wiry, shoulders squared beneath a brown uniform jacket, the silver star on her chest dulled by time, but polished clean. Her hair, iron gray streaked with white, was pulled back into a no-nonsense bun, though wisps framed a face lined with years of long nights and hard truths. Her skin was pale, weathered, with a scattering of freckles that hinted at a youth spent outdoors. Her eyes, a sharp steel blue, missed nothing. They were eyes that measured and judged, cutting to the bone. She looked up from a stack of paperwork when Thomas entered. "Grayson," she said, her tone flat but not unfriendly. "Haven't seen you in town for months. What brings you in?" Thomas closed the door behind him. He hesitated only a moment, then set the recorder and the plastic sleeve of documents onto her desk. "I found something," he said. "Something buried out on my land." Whitlock leaned forward, her brow furrowing as she examined the items. She picked up the recorder, turning it in her hands like it was a relic dredged from a river. "This working?" "Play it," Thomas said. When Emily Saunders's voice filled the office, the sheriff's expression hardened. She didn't flinch at the girl's sobs or the static, but when the name Burnham Foundation crackled through the speakers, her jaw tightened. She clicked it off, the silence between them suddenly heavy. Whitlock leaned back, her chair creaking. For a long time she said nothing, studying Thomas with those sharp blue eyes. Finally she sighed, rubbing at the bridge of her nose. "There was a case," she said quietly. "Back in '91. A bus full of kids went missing on their way to a camp program. No trace. Families screamed for answers, but the investigation went nowhere. The official story was mechanical failure, maybe a crash into one of the rivers. No wreckage ever found." Thomas crossed his arms, his face set in granite. "Because it wasn't an accident. They buried it." Whitlock gave a slow nod, her gaze flicking to the documents. "The Burnhams had fingers in every pie back then. Clinics, research grants, even campaign money for the governor. I was just a deputy then, still wet behind the ears, but I remember the whispers. We were told to stay out of it. Files disappeared, witness statements vanished, and then people stopped asking questions." She leaned forward again, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You need to understand, Grayson. The Burnhams aren't just rich. They're entrenched. They own hospitals, judges, maybe even half the state house. If they find out you dug this up, they'll come for you. And not with subpoenas, with shovels." Thomas met her eyes, unblinking. "They already came for those kids. I won't look the other way." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "God help us both," she muttered. She reached for the recorder again, slipping it into an evidence bag. "I'll keep this locked, but we need more than a 30-year-old tape. If we're going to take this anywhere, we'll need ironclad proof." As she spoke, a shadow moved past the office window. Thomas's instincts prickled. He turned his head just enough to catch the reflection of a dark SUV idling across the street. Its windows were tinted, its engine running though no one exited. The driver was just a vague silhouette, still as a stone. Whitlock followed his gaze, her jaw tightening. "They're fast," she said. "Faster than I thought." Thomas felt his hand flex toward an old reflex, searching for a weapon he no longer carried. Shadow, lying at his feet, gave a low growl, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. The sheriff stood, her posture rigid. "You should get back to your cabin, Grayson. Keep your head low. If they're watching, we can't spook them yet. But make no mistake, this just became bigger than you and me." Thomas inclined his head, his face like stone. He understood. The game had already begun. As he left the sheriff's office, the black SUV's engine revved slightly, its presence a silent promise. Shadow pressed close against his leg, hackles raised. The silence of West Virginia had been broken. Now, the shadows were moving. The road to Red Hollow wound like a scar through the hills, a narrow two-lane strip hemmed in by thick woods that seemed to lean closer with every mile. Thomas Grayson drove his pickup with steady hands. Shadow stretched across the seat beside him, the shepherd's amber eyes flicking from road to trees with alert precision. Sheriff Ada Whitlock followed behind in her county-issued SUV, the headlights cutting pale arcs through the mist. They traveled in silence, but the silence was no longer comforting. It was heavy with expectation, the knowledge that each turn in the road might uncover another ghost. Red Hollow had once been a mining town, but now it was little more than a husk. Empty storefronts slumped against one another, windows boarded or shattered, graffiti curling across brick walls that no one had painted over in decades. At the end of Main Street stood a squat concrete building with faded lettering, Community Health Clinic. Its sign swung limply on rusted chains, and the front doors hung ajar. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with mildew and dust. The waiting room's linoleum was cracked, chairs overturned, magazines from the late 1980s scattered like autumn leaves. Thomas swept his flashlight across the walls, the beam catching on old posters about vaccinations and nutrition programs. Everything smelled faintly of chemicals and abandonment. Sheriff Whitlock walked ahead, her boots crunching on broken glass. "I came here once," she murmured, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "Back when the bus went missing. This place was locked up tight then. No one was allowed near it. The Burnhams said it was being renovated for safety." She spat softly onto the floor. "I should have known better." They moved deeper into the clinic, past examination rooms with rusting tables and cabinets hanging off hinges. Shadow sniffed constantly, tail low, nose pressed to the ground as though tracking the ghosts of children long gone. In the back, they found a small room that once served as a storage area. Against one wall stood an old refrigerator, its enamel body yellowed and streaked with rust. Thomas pulled the door open with a grunt. Inside, the stale air carried the faint tang of chemicals. Beneath broken trays and rotted insulation lay a stack of plastic folders wrapped in tape. He set them on a table, peeling the brittle adhesive away. A Polaroid photo slipped free. The colors had faded, but the image was unmistakable. A group of children smiling nervously beside a yellow school bus, their summer clothes bright against the steel frame. At the bottom, written in thick marker, were the words, Cohort A, 711. Whitlock's breath caught. "That's them," she whispered. "The missing kids." Thomas flipped through the folders, receipts, inventory lists, shipping records. One sheet bore the heading of the Burnham Foundation, stamped with their crest. At the bottom was a signature in sharp, practiced strokes. Dr. Ezra Vale. Whitlock frowned. Vale. He was one of their top physicians. Heard rumors he ran experimental programs out here. No one ever proved it. He vanished sometime in the late 90s. Before Thomas could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Instinct kicked in. He shoved the papers back into the folder, hand brushing the handle of his knife. Shadow's ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in its throat. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. He was a man in his mid-50s, tall but stooped at the shoulders, his frame wiry from a life of labor. His face was narrow, skin pale and lined with worry, his gray hair hanging in untidy strands. A rough beard shadowed his jaw, patchy and unkempt. His eyes, muddy brown, tired but sharp, darted between Thomas and Whitlock, widening when they landed on the Polaroid in Thomas's hand. "Put that down," he said, his voice cracked, half plea, half command. Whitlock's hand hovered near her holster. "Name?" The man swallowed, throat working. "Neil Parson." His voice trembled. I was a driver. Back then. The other bus." Thomas's eyes narrowed. He remembered Emily's voice on the tape, mentioning a Mr. Parson. His grip on the folder tightened. "You were there." Neil nodded, shoulders sagging. "I didn't have a choice. They told me it was for research, for the good of the kids. Said they'd be helping cure diseases, making history. But when I saw the way the men looked at us, the white coats, the boxes of needles, I knew it wasn't right. They threatened me. Said if I talked, my family would pay." His hands shook as he rubbed them together, dirt embedded deep in his nails. "I drove them off the main road like they said. I watched them march those kids into this building, and I never saw them again." Whitlock's jaw clenched. "You kept this secret for 35 years? Neil's eyes glistened. "Do you think I could have spoken? Burnham had men in every office, every courtroom. I tried once. Got a letter under my door the next morning. No words, just a photo of my wife at the grocery store. I knew what it meant." He wiped at his face, rough with stubble. "I left. Came back here years later because guilt won't let me sleep. I walk these halls every week like penance." Thomas studied him in silence. The man looked broken, guilt carved into every line of his thin body. He could smell the fear clinging to him, but also the truth. Neil wasn't a mastermind. He was another pawn who had been crushed under the weight of the Burnham's power. Whitlock lowered her hand from her weapon, though her voice was sharp as steel. "If you want redemption, Mr. Parson, you're going to have to testify. Your word, that Polaroid, these records, together they might finally break this wide open." Neil's gaze flicked to the window, where outside the sun was slipping behind the trees. His shoulders slumped. "You don't understand. They'll know you found this. They always know. You're not safe now. None of us are." A sudden noise outside, the faint rumble of an engine, made them all freeze. Shadow bristled, growling low. Thomas stepped to the window, catching the flash of headlights sweeping across the street. A car idled briefly, then pulled away into the fading dusk. The message was clear. The shadows were watching Red Hollow, too. The following morning broke gray and heavy, clouds sagging low over the ridgelines of West Virginia, promising rain. Thomas Grayson sat on the porch of his farmhouse, shadow curled at his boots, while the echo of last night's discovery gnawed at him like a steady drumbeat. The Polaroid, the receipt, Neil Parson's trembling confession. They were no longer rumors of the Burnham Foundation's sins. They were tangible proof. But proof, he knew, was only as strong as the hands that guarded it. Sheriff Ada Whitlock arrived just after sunrise, her county SUV rolling to a stop in a spray of gravel. She stepped out stiffly, fatigue etched into the lines of her face. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, her silver-streaked auburn hair pulled tight beneath her hat. But exhaustion weighed her movements. She carried a battered leather folder tucked under one arm, and her lips were pressed into a thin, grim line. "They lost it," she said without preamble, slamming the folder down on Thomas's porch table. "Every piece of evidence we turned in yesterday, gone. The prosecutor's office claims the files were never logged. The clerk swore she never saw them. The photo, the receipt, even my chain of custody report, it's all been erased." Thomas's jaw tightened. His face was a map of weathered lines, but now it hardened into something closer to stone. "Erased," he repeated. "Not lost. Burnham's hands reach deeper than we thought." Whitlock's hazel eyes burned with fury and something colder. Resignation. "I've been in this county for 35 years. I've seen cases vanish before, but never like this. Never so deliberate. They've locked the doors, Thomas. Every official route is blocked." Shadow lifted his head, sensing the tension, his ears pricking toward the two of them. Thomas leaned back, rubbing a calloused hand across his beard. He had expected something like this, but hearing it aloud set a different fire burning in his chest. After a long silence, he rose, walked inside, and returned with a small canvas satchel. He placed it on the table and unzipped it. Inside lay several folders, yellowed with age, the ink faded but legible. He pushed them toward her. "What's this?" "Insurance," Thomas said flatly. "I didn't tell you last night because I didn't know who I could trust. When Shadow and I first broke open that bus, before I called you, I found these stuffed under one of the seats. I took them. Figured if someone tried to bury the truth, at least one part of it would survive." Whitlock opened the folder. Her brows furrowed as she flipped through pages stamped with the Burnham crest and typed in the cold language of contracts. At the top of the first document read the words, "Pilot Program Agreement." The pages detailed funding from the Burnham Foundation to the Red Hollow Clinic, allocating resources for pediatric cohorts. The language was clinical, detached, subjects to be monitored. For physiological response, duration 6 months, outcomes confidential. Signatures lined the bottom, Dr. Ezra Vale and a representative of the foundation. Whitlock's hand trembled. They signed children into experiments, legally, and buried them when it went wrong. Her voice cracked into a whisper. "God help us." Thomas's eyes remained steady, though shadows flickered in their depths. God had nothing to do with this. Men did. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the pages pressing down like lead. Finally, Whitlock shut the folder with a decisive snap. "This changes things. They can lose Polaroids and receipts, but a signed contract? A partnership agreement? This is dynamite. But we need more. Something that connects the names on this paper to the bodies in that bus. Something they can't dismiss as forged or circumstantial." Thomas nodded. "Then we find it, however deep we have to dig." The crunch of tires interrupted them. Both turned as Neil Parsons' battered sedan rattled into the drive. The man climbed out slowly, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world pressed down on him. He wore a threadbare plaid shirt, the cuffs frayed, and his face was pale with sleeplessness. He avoided their eyes as he shuffled onto the porch. "I shouldn't be here," Neil said, voice low, glancing nervously at the tree line. "If they see me talking to you, I'm finished." "You're already finished if you keep running," Thomas said bluntly. "Sit." Neil lowered himself onto the porch step, wringing his hands. "I dreamed of those kids again last night. Their faces. I can't wash it away. You don't understand. The Burnhams. They own the judges, the banks, half the county. Every door you knock on, they're standing behind it." Whitlock crouched, her tone softer now. "Then help us open a door they can't lock. You were there. You saw things no one else did. Tell us about Vale, about who gave the orders." Neil swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Vale. He wasn't just a doctor. He was their fixer. Cold, polite, always with a notebook. He wrote down everything. They called him meticulous. I call him dangerous. If you want proof, you'll need his notes. He never trusted memory. He wrote it all. But when he disappeared, so did his journals." Thomas's gaze sharpened. "Where?" Neil shook his head. "I don't know. But if anyone does, it's the Burnham's archivist, a woman named Margaret Coyle. Old, careful, lives like a shadow. She kept records for them for decades. If Vale's notes exist, she'd have tucked them away." Whitlock's expression hardened. "Then she's our next lead." Rain began to fall, tapping on the porch roof in a steady rhythm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing across the hills. Thomas looked from Whitlock to Neil, then down at Shadow, who sat watchful, his fur damp from the mist but his eyes unwavering. "They tried to bury children in silence," Thomas said at last, his voice steady as iron. "We'll bury their lies instead." Whitlock extended her hand across the table, palm open. Thomas stared for a beat, then placed his rough hand in hers. Neil hesitated before adding his own, trembling though it was. 3 hands, bound not by trust, but by necessity. Outside, through the curtain of rain, a dark SUV rolled slowly past the farm on the distant road, its tinted windows glinting like eyes. The message was unmistakable. They were being watched. But for the first time, Thomas felt something other than dread. He felt resolve. The storm that had swept across the valley during the day left the air wet and metallic by nightfall, the kind of damp that clung to the skin and made every breath feel heavy. The farmhouse was silent, but for the occasional creak of its old beams. Thomas Grayson sat at his worn oak table, a map spread before him, the light of a single oil lamp throwing long shadows across the wood. His eyes, deep-set and weary, followed the penciled routes he had drawn, the false path and the real one. Shadow, stretched out by the door, lifted his head and gave a low growl, sensing the tension in his master. Thomas leaned back, rubbing a hand across his beard, coarse with gray. He had spent years in war zones crafting diversions, building illusions to confuse enemies who thought themselves untouchable. Now he used those same instincts against the Burnhams. Earlier that afternoon, he had stopped by a diner in town, loud enough for a groundskeeper from the estate to overhear, muttering about a silver hummingbird earring buried in the barns. A breadcrumb, meant to be swallowed. But the truth lay elsewhere. The real Burnham storage warehouse sat on the edge of their sprawling estate in a hollow of trees, a corrugated steel structure that looked more like a forgotten grain depot than a vault of secrets. That was where he would go. By midnight, the clouds had parted enough for a few pale stars to pierce the darkness. Thomas pulled on his old military jacket, slipped a small flashlight and crowbar into his pack, and whistled once. Shadow rose at once, the German shepherd's lean body tense, his coat a dark mix of sable and black that blended easily into the shadows. His paws barely whispered against the ground as they moved together into the night. The warehouse loomed ahead like a beast crouching in the trees. Its siding was streaked with rust, its roof sagging slightly, but Thomas knew better than to be fooled by appearances. The Burnhams were masters of concealment. He approached carefully, sweeping his flashlight only once across the perimeter before switching it off and working by instinct. Shadow sniffed at the seams of the sliding door, his tail stiff. Thomas slid the crowbar into the lock and gave a sharp, practiced jerk. The metal shrieked softly before surrendering. Inside, the air smelled of dust, oil, and mildew. Wooden crates were stacked along the walls, their stencils faded. Medical equipment, property of Burnham Foundation. Old file cabinets lined one corner, their drawers chained shut. Thomas's eyes scanned the space with the methodical calm of a soldier. He moved to the center aisle, pried open a crate, and brushed aside packing straw. A jumble of expired medical kits lay within, but something glimmered faintly beneath. He reached down, his fingers closing around something small and cold. When he drew it into the beam of his flashlight, his breath caught. A silver earring shaped like a hummingbird, wings outstretched mid-flight. Tarnished, but unmistakable. Emily Hayes's words rang in his memory. Her sister never went anywhere without the pair. The other had been found decades ago. This one proved she'd been here. Thomas slipped the earring into a cloth pouch and tucked it inside his jacket. Shadow shifted uneasily, ears flicking toward the door. Thomas froze. He knew that posture. It was the stance of prey sensing the predator before it showed itself. The sound came then. The crunch of tires on gravel, slow, deliberate. A vehicle stopped outside, then boots, measured, purposeful, on wet ground. A voice carried through the thin steel walls, smooth yet heavy with contempt. "I wondered when the soldier would come sniffing," drawled a man's tone. "Did you really think we wouldn't hear?" Thomas's muscles coiled. He recognized that arrogance. He stepped into the shadows, motioning Shadow silently beside him. The door groaned as it slid open, spilling a wedge of moonlight inside. A tall figure entered, framed in the pale glow. Edmund Burnham was not a man who blended into the dark. He was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered despite his age, his presence commanding in a way that spoke of generations of power. His face was sharp, with high cheekbones and a neatly trimmed silver beard that only added to the severity of his features. His suit was black, tailored even for this midnight visit, but the incongruity was the pistol in his gloved hand, an old Colt, polished and heavy. His eyes, pale gray like cold ash, swept the room with the confidence of a predator, certain of his kill. "You've been busy, Grayson," Burnham said, his voice smooth but edged. "Digging up bones that should have stayed buried, playing detective with ghosts." He raised the pistol slightly, almost casually. "But ghosts don't testify, and neither will you." Shadow growled low, a rumble like thunder. Burnham's gaze flicked to the dog, and he sneered. "And you brought the mutt, fitting, always loyal even to lost causes." Thomas said nothing, his mind racing, his stance steady. The hummingbird earring in his pocket felt like fire, proof worth dying for, but proof that would mean nothing if it never saw daylight. He measured the distance between Burnham and himself, the crates, the dark corners of the warehouse. Every instinct screamed that this was no longer reconnaissance. This was survival. The silence stretched, broken only by the drip of rain through the roof. Burnham's finger tightened on the trigger. The warehouse smelled of rust and old straw, shadows clinging to the corners like cobwebs. Thomas Grayson stood still, his breath steady though his chest tightened with the awareness of the pistol leveled at him. Shadow growled at his side, a low, vibrating sound that made the air feel heavier. Edmund Burnham's pale gray eyes gleamed with the certainty of a man who believed the game was already won. "You don't understand, Grayson," Burnham said, his voice smooth but full of arrogance, like a lecturer addressing a student. "I've been burying things longer than you've been digging. A bus full of children, doctors with guilty consciences, politicians with wavering loyalties. They all disappear the same way. A shovel of dirt and a little money. You've stepped into something far larger than your imagination can contain." He tilted his head, the silver streaks in his beard catching the moonlight from the broken roof. "I've buried it all, soldier, and tonight I bury you." Thomas said nothing, his gaze steady. He had heard men talk like this before, warlords in faraway deserts, generals whose uniforms were stained with other people's blood. They all carried the same arrogance, and most of them fell the same way. His hand brushed against his pocket, where the hummingbird earring rested like a brand of truth. Burnham raised the pistol higher, a cruel smile curling his lips. "Loyalty is a curse, Grayson. It makes men like you predictable. You came here for justice, and justice is just another grave I own." Before the words could hang too long in the air, a sudden burst of light shattered the darkness. Floodlamps flared from both sides of the warehouse, blinding in their brilliance. Burnham blinked, lowering his arm instinctively as voices rang out, sharp and commanding. "Sheriff's Department, drop the weapon!" The steel door slammed open, and Sheriff Ada Whitlock strode in first, her figure tall and unyielding. She was clad not in her usual worn jacket, but in a tactical vest, her silver hair catching the harsh light, her blue eyes locked on Burnham with a fury sharpened by decades of silence. Behind her, 3 deputies moved in formation, rifles raised, their boots crunching on the concrete floor. Whitlock's voice carried across the warehouse, calm and unshakable. "It's over, Burnham. We've got the tapes, the Polaroid, the documents, and now the earring. Enough to shatter every locked door you've hidden behind." Burnham froze, the pistol still in his hand, though his expression flickered between disbelief and rage. "You think this circus means anything?" he spat. "Half this town owes me their livelihoods. Judges dine at my table. Senators call me friend. You'll vanish like the rest of them, forgotten and filed away." Whitlock took a step forward, her jaw set like stone. "The difference, Edmund, is that this time you showed up with the gun in your hand, and the whole county will see it." For Sir Hans, the first time, uncertainty rippled across Burnham's face. He glanced toward Thomas, who stood silently in the shadows, arms loose at his sides, Shadow bristling beside him. The dog growled louder, and Burnham's pistol hand trembled. "Drop it!" barked one of the deputies, a tall man in his 30s with cropped hair and a scar across his cheek. A soldier-turned-lawman named Deputy Carter Wells, known for his steady aim and unflinching resolve. His rifle was trained directly on Burnham's chest. Burnham's arrogance faltered. His eyes darted to the glaring lights, to the circle of weapons trained on him, to Whitlock's unwavering gaze. With a guttural curse, he let the pistol clatter to the floor, the sound echoing like a broken bell. Whitlock moved forward herself, producing a pair of handcuffs from her belt. She snapped them on his wrists with a force that made him wince, her voice a low hiss only he could hear. 30 years too late, but the ground you used to bury others will finally bury your lies." The deputies secured him, reading his rights as Shadow barked once, sharp and triumphant, the sound echoing off the steel walls. Outside, news of Burnham's arrest traveled faster than the night wind. By dawn, Fairhaven buzzed like a hornet's nest. People gathered on porches, whispering in shock, their voices carrying through the valley. For decades, Edmund Burnham had been the benefactor, the smiling face behind scholarships, hospital wings, and campaign donations. To see him marched out in handcuffs under the floodlights of law shook the town to its core. In the warehouse, Whitlock finally allowed herself a breath. She looked at Thomas, her expression softening for the first time. "You played your part well. The trap only works when the prey believes the bait." Thomas nodded once, his face unreadable. "He buried children," he said simply. "Shadow just dug them back up." The German shepherd pressed against his leg, eyes still glowing with the feral satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered his prey. Thomas scratched behind the dog's ears, the gesture quiet but filled with meaning. Outside, as Burnham was loaded into the sheriff's cruiser, his pale eyes swept over the gathering crowd. His lips curled, but there was no smile now, only the look of a man who had ruled with silence and shadows, finally dragged into the light. The doors had been locked for decades. Tonight, they had been broken. The days after Edmund Burnham's arrest carried a strange hush across Fairhaven, as though the valley itself was stunned by the unmasking of one of its most celebrated sons. The local paper ran with headlines that screamed of betrayal and horror, while townsfolk whispered on porches, their voices sharp with disbelief and relief in equal measure. For 35 years, Burnham had walked as a benefactor, building schools, funding hospitals, and donating to churches. Now he was revealed as the architect of a crime that had stolen children and shattered families. Thomas Grayson moved quietly through those days, preferring the silence of his farm to the noise of speculation. Yet silence no longer felt like the burden it once had. Now it carried the weight of something earned, a quiet made possible by the truth clawed out of the earth. Shadow remained close, pacing the porch, his keen amber eyes scanning the road as though waiting for another threat. But the war, for once, seemed finished. Sheriff Ada Whitlock stopped by on the third day, her cruiser pulling into the gravel drive. She looked older than she had a week ago, her silver hair loose, her uniform traded for a plain cardigan and slacks. She carried in her hand a slim envelope stamped with the seal of the county court. "It's official," she said, handing it over. "The case has been filed. The contracts, the Polaroid, the earring, the recorder, it's all on record. The Burnham name won't bury this anymore." Thomas studied her face. There were lines around her mouth, deeper now, but her blue eyes were steady. She had fought a battle not in the woods or on the field, but in courtrooms and archives, and she bore the marks of it. "You did what no one else would," Thomas said quietly. Whitlock shook her head. "We did. You, me, and that dog of yours." She crouched and scratched Shadow gently behind the ears, the German shepherd leaning into her touch. "Don't underestimate what loyalty can accomplish." That afternoon, Thomas drove into town. The Hayes family had asked to meet him. Their home was a modest clapboard house on the outskirts, its porch crowded with pots of fading chrysanthemums. Emily Hayes opened the door. She was in her late 50s now, her hair once blonde but now a soft silver, cut to her shoulders. Her face bore the kind of lines carved by grief and endurance, but her eyes, green and clear, carried warmth despite the sorrow that had shadowed them for decades. Inside the living room, photographs covered the mantel. Children, grandchildren, and at the center, a framed picture of a young girl with bright hair tied back, smiling with all the hope of youth. Sarah Hayes. Thomas set a small wooden box on the table. He had crafted it himself, its surface sanded smooth, the lid carved with the faint outline of a hummingbird in flight. He slid it toward Emily. "These belong to your sister." Emily's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside lay the micro-cassette recorder, its plastic shell carefully cleaned, and the silver hummingbird earring, polished but still dulled by time. For a long moment she said nothing, her breath catching. Finally tears slid down her cheeks. "For years we prayed for answers, and now—" Her voice faltered, but her eyes lifted to Thomas, shimmering. "Now we can grieve. We can finally let her rest." Shadow padded forward, nudging Emily's hand with his nose. She smiled faintly, stroking the dog's head. "She must have led him to you," Emily whispered. "She must have." Thomas inclined his head, unwilling to speak against the possibility. He had seen too much, lived too much, to dismiss such things. Later, as dusk deepened and the world turned violet with the coming night, Thomas sat on his porch once more. The valley was quiet, cicadas buzzing in the woods, the faint smell of rain still lingering in the air. He leaned back in his chair, his old leather jacket draped across the armrest. Shadow lay beside him, resting his head across Thomas's knee, his breathing slow and steady. Thomas looked down at him, his hand moving gently through the coarse fur. "You're no stray," he murmured. "You're my brother in arms. You carried me to the truth." The dog gave a small huff of air, eyes half-lidded, content in the safety of this new bond. Two forgotten warriors, the soldier and the sentinel, sat together as the stars emerged over West Virginia's dark ridges. For the first time in decades, Thomas felt the kind of peace that did not come from isolation, but from belonging. He had not sought a mission, but the mission had found him. And in completing it, he had found not just justice for the dead, but a reason to live again. The silence no longer oppressed him. It healed. Even after 35 years, God showed that truth cannot stay buried. Through the loyalty of a soldier and his dog, justice finally came, and healing began. Remember, in our own lives, no matter how dark things seem, God can bring light, hope, and miracles. If this story touched your heart, please share it with friends, drop a comment to tell us what you felt, and hit that subscribe button to follow more stories of faith, love, and courage. May God bless you and your family always.